Readers of the Bible will know all too well of the ill-fated Tower of Babel. But is the Bible thorough enough when it tells us of this unholy monument? Some may disagree. After all, we don't know exactly why the tower was constructed, how such an impressive design was built, or what even happened to it after God disperses the workers. Was this sordid skyscraper a means by which man could invade the heavens? Did this spire make God nervous over mankind's ambitious nature? Or could this have been a construction that man sought to use should his God flood the earth again? Join me as we explore the lore behind the Bible's most contested landmark and go deep into the Tower of Babel. The majority of what most know about the Tower of Babel comes from a brief part of chapter 11 of Genesis, where the Bible explains that at that early time in history, the world had one language and one common speech. These early inhabitants of the earth moved as one people, traveling throughout the land until eventually settling in the desert plains of Shinar. Here, though, they have the grand idea of building a city. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." As we can see, there doesn't appear to be any motivation for wanting to build this tower, except for the sake of fame. From the passage alone, these early settlers don't seem to be insidious or underhanded. They might be categorized as ambitious, yes, but there doesn't appear to be anything too outrageous about wanting to build this tower. In fact, some might argue here that the tower was to be a beacon, a pillar that was so tall that it could be seen from great distances and allow for wanderers to make their way home. Notice how the early settlers are concerned about being scattered over the face of the earth, perhaps afraid of getting lost or separated. As we know, this is ironically what ends up happening to them when God becomes aware of their progress on the tower. But the fact that this may have been an effort to guide or signal would-be drifters might frame the whole incident in a more innocent light. Obviously, God doesn't see it this way at all, and immediately sees the potential for man's hubris. He declares, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other." It's hard to imagine God not being impressed by mankind's building. Remember, they would have been using some pretty archaic tools to have erected this tower, and the fact that it was raised high enough to warrant God's concern shows us that they were having considerable success with it, and probably would have completed it too. One idea here is that it wasn't the tower itself that was an affront to God, but rather what the tower represented: mankind's unfiltered ingenuity to create anything they wanted. A tower was one thing, but some argue that this unity would see mankind create even worse things: objects, monuments, perhaps even weapons, all of which could and would be used for sin. To avoid such a possibility ever arising, God confused the language of the people at Shinar, making it so they couldn't understand each other, and thus could not finish the construction of the tower. From there, the people grew so frustrated with their inability to communicate that they stopped building the city altogether, and were then scattered over the face of the earth. This is fundamentally all the Bible really tells us about the Tower of Babel, and from there, much of its role in the narrative is open to interpretation. One of the more popular theories is that God halted the production of the tower because the height of it was legitimately nearing his own domain. Or, at the very least, from a metaphorical point of view, the tower was symbolic of man becoming as high as God. Naturally, man needed to be humbled for such effrontery, and prevented from achieving such a blasphemous outcome. In his work, Legends of Old Testament Characters, early 20th century priest Sabine Barine Gould tells us of a somewhat more outlandish take on the Tower of Babel, involving the biblical king Nimrod. He tells us that after the times of the Great Deluge, the people of the earth lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, fearful that God would flood the earth again. This was especially true for those who no longer listened to the words of Noah and began to emulate behaviors seen in the old world. In fact, the legend tells us that Noah's authority dwindled in favor of the outwardly powerful king of the land, Nimrod. We know Nimrod had attained a mighty reputation during his sovereignty, being known in the Bible as a great hunter and a mighty warrior. However, his reputation was to only grow when his father Cush gave him the garment which God had made for Adam when he had been expelled from the Garden of Eden. Gould tells us that these garments, having been made by God, possessed divine powers, and that in this instance, the clothing could grant the wearer immense strength, invulnerability, and even the ability to speak to animals. Perhaps then this is how Nimrod came to be known as such a fierce hunter and mighty warrior. Gould tells us that as a result of wearing this garment, Nimrod became unconquerable and irresistible. All the beasts and the birds fell down before him, and his enemies were overcome almost without struggle. This is, we are told, how he overcame the king of Babylon and overtook that kingdom, becoming more and more powerful until one day he was monarch over the whole world. With such power at his disposal, Nimrod found he didn't need to worship God anymore. In fact, when the people witnessed his power, they failed to see a need for God either, given Nimrod's unnatural abilities. And so the people came to acknowledge Nimrod first and God second, if at all. Yet Nimrod was still unsatisfied. In fact, we are led to believe that he became quite anxious, fearing that God would empower someone to overthrow him for his blatant hubris. With this thought on his mind, he decided that it was better to strike God first before God could strike him. With this in mind, he said unto his subjects, "Come, let us build a great city, and let us settle therein, that we may not be scattered over the face of the earth, and be destroyed once more by a flood. And in the midst of our city, let us build a high tower, so lofty as to overtop any flood, and so strong as to resist any fire. Yea, let us do further, let us prop up the heaven on all sides from the top of the tower, that it may not again fall and inundate us. Then let us climb into heaven, and break it up with axes, and drain its water away, where it can do no injury. Thus shall we avenge the death of our ancestors." You'll notice here that Gould incorporates much of the dialogue spoken by the settlers at Shinar in the Genesis account, and attributes these words to Nimrod before further elaborating on them. Here we understand why they are building the tower in the first place, partially as a means of self-preservation against another divine flood, but also as a means to facilitate their vengeance, so that they might climb up to heaven and avenge those who drowned in the flood. Gould makes it clear that not all of his subjects were fully on board with Nimrod's reign, but they were on board with defending against another deluge. They could not deny that this tower that Nimrod spoke of could have been the perfect countermeasure against God, should he have tried to drown them again, and so they fell in line with Nimrod's orders. We are told 600,000 men were sent to work under 1,000 captains, and raised the tower to the height of 70 miles. A great flight of stairs is built on the east side and used for carrying up materials, whilst on the west side, a flight of stairs descended for those who had already deposited their burdens. The work then was organised, surgical, perhaps even zealotry, for we are told if one worker fell from the tower and was killed, no one cared, but if any of the bricks gave way, then there was an outcry. According to Gould, some of Nimrod's men even shot arrows up into the sky when they were close enough, and when the arrows came back tinged with blood, they shouted and cried that they had killed someone in heaven, possibly even an angel. It's unclear from the account who exactly this blood belonged to, but it could just as easily be seen as an embellishment by Nimrod's men, who wanted to believe in the idea that they were getting closer to heaven. At this point in time, Abraham was 48 years old and was full of grief and shame at the impiety of his fellow man. So he prayed to God, and we are told in this account that it is Abraham who gives God the idea of confounding their tongues, so that the workers of the tower cannot understand each other. As we've seen in the traditional Genesis account, God comes to this conclusion all by himself after witnessing the construction of the tower, and comes to realize that if man is successful in building this tower, then who knows what they might achieve in the name of wickedness. However, in Gould's account, God sends his angels to effectively curse the workers so that they cannot understand each other, whereby they create 70 distinct languages and afflict man with them. As a result, this causes the men to drift away from the tower and away from each other, until they are spread all over the surface of the earth. Gould goes further into the fate of this tower, however, telling us that the top portion of it was destroyed by a fire from the heavens, and that the basement was ruined by an earthquake. In an Islamic tradition of the Tower of Babel, we are told that Nimrod was actually the son of Canaan and the brother of Cush. In this account, Nimrod, having become angered by Abraham, who had refused to acknowledge him as the supreme monarch, casts him into a fire. Yet by the protection of his God, Abraham emerged from the fire unharmed. Now Nimrod saw this as an act of war against him, but he knew he could do nothing against Abraham, for God would protect him. So he decided to cut Abraham off at the source. He would go to heaven himself and have words with this God, and if he didn't see reason, he would beat him into submission. His advisors were less thrilled by this plan. I mean, they were aware of God's power. They'd literally seen it demonstrated in the protection of Abraham. What's more, they knew heaven was really, really high up, and so they weren't even sure if it was feasible to build something of the like. Yet Nimrod could not be dissuaded, and so for 3 years, thousands upon thousands of men toiled to create the tower every day. But never was Nimrod seemingly any closer to heaven. One morning, he woke to find the tower had been destroyed, toppled either by the elements or by God himself. Nimrod could not be sure, but he was not deterred. He ordered a firmer foundation to be laid for the structure, and so a second tower was erected. Yet it too fell short of reaching heaven. With this second failure, Nimrod tried a more unique approach by crafting a large box that he could sit in and attaching 4 gigantic birds, known as Roc in Persian and Arabian mythology, to each corner. The birds lifted Nimrod high in the air. Indeed, the first flight by man, it would seem. Eventually though, the box was upset and Nimrod went tumbling out, landing hard on a mountain which he inexplicably crushed beneath him, splitting it down the middle. Despite yet another failure, Nimrod was not ready to submit, and we are led to believe he began to try other machinations in order to reach heaven. So God went ahead and confused the language of his subjects, just as he did in the biblical account, and thus a large portion of his kingdom were unable to communicate with him, and left to start their own tribes and settlements. Finally, without any recourse to reach heaven, God added salt to the wound by sending a wind, which overthrew the tower and buried Nimrod beneath it. According to 20th century rabbi Louis Ginzberg, in his work Legends of the Jews, his account echoes much of the same as Gould's, where we are told the building of this tower was a rebellion against God, and that there were 3 sorts of rebels amongst the builders. The first consisted of those who wanted to go to war with God, and believed that building the tower was the most efficient way of reaching him. The second consisted of those who wanted to set up their idols in heaven, paying worship to them on God's doorstep as a way to rage bait him. The third consisted of those who wanted to invade heaven with bows and spears, and saw the completion of the tower as the only means to reach their destination. Ginzberg adds some finer details to the story, which help outline the urgency and desperation of the builders, where we are told that the women of the society were in charge of making the bricks for the tower, and that because so many bricks were required, the women were not permitted to take breaks. In fact, he notes that even pregnant women were not exempt from this duty, and that should they need to give birth to a child, they were expected to do so quickly, and then, upon delivering, would have to tie the baby to their backs and carry on brickmaking. Once more, the traditional Genesis account allows us to believe that the confusing of mankind's language and the disorientation that followed was punishment enough. But Ginzberg's account allows for more deliberation on behalf of God, who did tailor the punishment according to the sin of the rebels. Those who intended to set up idols in heaven to worship in God's own realm were turned into apes and phantoms. Those who had intended to invade heaven with spears and bows were turned against each other, whilst those who had planned a direct war with him were the ones who were scattered across the earth. Ginzberg notes here that the infliction of punishment for those who intended to fight God was comparatively lenient to the others. Whilst they were robbed of their ability to communicate and thwarted in their objective, they at the very least got to continue living. Ginzberg reconciles that the reason for this is because God set high value upon peace and harmony. The first group of rebels only sought to anger God by bringing their idols into heaven, whilst the second group sought to cause chaos by harming the innocents of heaven. The third group, whilst the most blasphemous, at the very least, confined their malice toward God and God alone. Unlike the generation of the deluge who became depraved and bore hatred toward each other, the third group of rebels at the tower were united in their mission, albeit to kill God. Ginzberg frames this as God almost respecting the effort, and thus, though he takes away their ability to communicate, doesn't take away their lives. This then leads me to the final question of today's episode. Was God scared of the building of the tower? There's certainly some reasons to think so. Even if you exclude the Jewish legends and rely solely on the narrative in the Bible, God legitimately takes the threat of the tower seriously. He voices that if mankind did achieve their construction, then nothing would be beyond them. Could then the Tower of Babel have merely been a stepping stone for us to discover a power or a technology that would in effect make us gods? God's concern for man's seemingly inevitable success causes him to spring into action. He doesn't just instruct man to stop, but rather sabotages them and makes it impossible for them to continue. It's almost as if he knew that if he knocked their tower over, they'd only end up building another one. He needed a permanent solution to prevent this sort of activity from happening again, and considering the effort he puts into preventing this, you might say it is representative of fear, perhaps even nervousness, that man was getting too close to him. One of the main ideas against this is that man could have only built the tower so high before they'd run out of oxygen. We have to assume from Genesis' own description of the cosmos that heaven is above the sky, whether that's geographically or spiritually. So from the very beginning, the effort to reach heaven by the builders is pretty absurd. Either they'd run out of air, or they'd never actually be able to breach heaven because it's a spiritual location. God's eagerness to stop the building then is almost unwarranted. In fact, you might say he was acting in man's best interests, preventing them from wasting their time, or worse, meeting their own doom. Another idea is that God had intended for man to scatter across the earth, but because they were so hell-bent on building this tower, they were not acting according to his plan. In the biblical account, the people who come to settle at Shinar even express a dislike for being separated or scattered. So it's possible that God confusing their language was not because he was afraid that they were actually going to come knocking at his door, but because he wanted them to hurry up and multiply across the earth, something they couldn't do if this tower was their main focus. Yet one other notion that suggests God was so quick to put an end to man's tower was because man was trying to reach the heights of God. He was trying to be on the same level of God by reaching his domain, and if we go by the Jewish legends, would have actually tried fighting God in an effort to overthrow him. The parallels between this idea and the fall of Lucifer are stark, with God no doubt sensing that man was heading the same way and would receive a much worse punishment, like Lucifer, for having failed in their rebellion. If anything then, you might say God punishing man early for what could be called a misdemeanor was a kindness, a means by which God prevented man from sinning further by actualizing his rebellion, which would no doubt incur a much dearer price. As always guys, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to leave this video a like and subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.